My brothers and sisters in Christ, today's first reading is one of the options, one of the readings that a couple can select for a nuptial mass, and it's one that very few do. I think this is because of a mistaken notion of what was perceived as speaking of gender norms or something backwards. In fact, of course, most people have experienced the most popular first reading is from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Love is patient, love is kind, and a list of kind of feeling words that people really connect with. But they lose track of the fact that Paul is the same one who writes both of these passages. And the misunderstanding of today's first reading is one ultimately that goes back to the core of sin. What do I mean by that? Well, in the Garden of Eden, as Adam and Eve are in right relationship with one another, with creation, with God, we see what goes wrong in original sin. There's this kind of lust for power dynamic, and that they see the opportunity to become gods themselves. And so this temptation not only sets them against God, but the immediate consequence of original sin is they're set upon each other. They look upon each other differently. They see that they're naked, they're vulnerable, they're in competition with one another. God asks what happens, they blame one another. And so this trickles down to today where we just can't help but see all things, and especially relationships, through a lens of power. No matter how we cover it with flowery language of relatable words and feeling words, but we relate and we act out of an idea of self-interest. This is contrary to the gospel and godlike love. And so what is it Paul is saying in our first reading today? The modern fallen person looks at it and sees wives be subordinate to your husbands and just shuts out the rest of the passage. Because now we're talking about backwards gender norms. The woman is subservient to the man, and we stop reading right there. But what does Paul go on to say? Forgetting the fact that he speaks elsewhere in the passage of subordination of all people to one another. But he uses this word for wives and then says, husbands, love your wives, and goes on to say, as Christ loves the church. Well, how did Christ love the church? Through pouring out his body and blood on the cross. This is a sacrificial love for the good of the other. And this, in fact, is perfect love. And so this is what Paul is saying should define a relationship. Whether you use a word of subordination, which we are meant to do with one another, and this is the beauty of the mystery of marriage. Two people are drawn through grace to be perfected in this love that ultimately is meant for all human beings. The love that Christ has for us, that perfected charity towards one another, which is not to act out of my own self-interest, not to see myself in competition with the other, or the other as an object for my own use or my own gain, but to will the good of the other, a sacrificial love, to long for the good of the other. That is the mystery of love. That is what a Christ-like love is, and that is what husbands and wives are invited to explore more deeply into through the mystery of marriage. But again, this is the same Paul who writes, love is patient, love is kind, these litany of words, but Paul is not writing about feelings, he's writing about the act of the will, which is actually what defines love, the act of the will in which I long for your good before my own. This is what husbands and wives are to do, not just to be companions on a journey of seeking of pleasure or happiness through our own means together, but to actually perfect each other, to come to completion in Christian love through outpouring of self for the other. Husbands sacrificing for their wives, wives for their husbands, to be brought to this mystery of the union of Christ and his church, the sacrificial love, which when we are perfected in it, we become the fullest version of ourselves who we are created to be. And so these words, which some people out of a misguided worldly sense that may be put off by these words, in fact, Paul is speaking of one of the most beautiful mysteries of Christian charity in today's reading. And whether we apply it to our marriages or simply to our relationships and even our union with God, it is one that is at the core of who God calls us to be, one that we are invited to explore more deeply. And so, brothers and sisters, may we be subordinate to one another, and may we love one another as Christ has loved us. May God bless you all.